I couldn't remember the rest of that message. I just got hung up on that verse. So I figured if you say it enough, it'll get across and make it look like you're making an impact on somebody. I get to talk about the 70s. I get to talk about that day that Carolyn came into my office. She worked for me in those days here at Azusa Pacific and had an idea. And I have no idea why I said, good. I was only in charge of the budget, and Carolyn supposedly worked for me, but John, you got some people like that probably in your department too, and so she was going to go whether I approved it or not. So I thought I'd get on board, and Carolyn and I were, you know, you've heard the story about the two senile people who are trying to remember something? Carolyn and I were trying to remember when this all started. She started going to Mexico in the 60s. She took Azusa students in the late 60s. But it was in 70 that she said, why don't we open this up and take some other people? She had taken other people before, but now let's make it formal and just take people. And that's what we're celebrating, 40 years of partnership with you and going to Mexico. And it's been quite a journey. You saw some of the pictures there. Carolyn, those are great shots of you. That's scary. You're right, John. The burning hair, I remember that. The beard, yeah. You had a beard? Oh, I had a beard, okay. Who here was there in the 70s? Would you stand up? Who was in Mexico in the 70s? A couple things stand out in my mind about the 70s. One was growth. The first year of the 70s, we had around 100 people there. We met inside the chapel. About 2 years later, we had a meeting, Carolyn and I in my office, and we talked about growth and how high could we go with this. And we both kind of had a magic number of 300. And we thought we could handle 300 people. The kitchen was in that church. The meeting hall was in that church. The kids were camped around the back of the church. We could handle 300, and really, we could handle that. It wouldn't get away from us. We could still be kind of in charge of everything. But as we discussed it, we decided, let's just see what God has in mind. And by the end of that decade, we were at 1,000. And it was wonderful. We discovered who the enemies were, and that we could survive those enemies, like rain. Some of you were there the year it rained for 3 days straight, right? Who was there? The year it rained 3 days straight. We couldn't get out to the villages. We couldn't have ministry. I remember my profound statement in chapel, and we were still meeting in that little church, and the mud was just about 6 inches deep in the church. And we said, you know, maybe this week God wants us to minister to each other. We had boards, 2x4s, laying all over the ground, going to the outhouses. And if you stepped off of that, you lost your shoe immediately. You could not get out of camp because we couldn't get the cars through the mud. 3 days we were there, but we survived. And we learned that. We can make this. The wind, sometimes it really, really blows. And before we realized that it was smart to take down the tents, we would chase those tents all over the field. But we learned that by taking them down, we could survive. And the kids do well putting the tents down. The sun. We moved chapel around because after we outgrew the church, then we had to be outside, and we would try different angles with the chapel, and we'd have them sitting different ways, trying to keep the kids from having to look into the sun. And we finally ended up quite early on with just the speaker looking into the sun and the kids, the back of their heads facing the sun. But even then, that was pretty brutal. We had one year where we had just dozens of kids with sunstroke. And I remember before chapel or during chapel that day, it was such a hot day we had thought maybe we shouldn't have chapel. And But we opened chapel with a prayer that God would protect us from the sun. And you know what? God floated this big cloud through the sky right over the chapel. We had shade for the chapel, and then it floated on. And I'll tell you, we learned something really important about God. He knew we were there, and we were safe. We were okay. Traffic. One of the big fears we had in 1970 was if we invite somebody else to come down and they have an accident, is Azusa Pacific responsible? And today, as you know, liability issues are enormous. And we prayed and talked about it, and I remember one of those early years, a van had no clue as to how to turn left on a Mexican highway and turned in front of a semi and got run right into a telephone pole, and every kid walked away from that van. God has really protected us. It has been amazing. The growth of the ministries. When we first started in the 70s, there were very few churches. And if they were churches, they were patios of somebody's house. Or they were a mud building someplace. And we had guys, John White, Louis Files, guys who were committed to building the church down there. And by the end of that decade, we had buildings there. I got to see some of those last week. We put a clinic up down there right at the end of the 70s. And we went out to the clinic last week and saw the clinic's ministry right on the epicenter. There's a big rip in the ground, goes right up to the clinic, goes right through the floor of the clinic, tiles up like this, goes out the other side, and the clinic is standing and it's operational. Those kids cleaned out about 10 inches of mud out of that huge clinic. The ministry that's gone on there is amazing. And you're going to meet tonight a product of Mexicali. And there's several of them down there we met this week. It's been a good journey. It's a good investment, Carolyn. Years ago, you started this thing, and it's been really fun to be a part of it. But that's kind of the picture of the beginning days. Small groups, and then it caught fire. We ended with that decade with 1,000 people. We were in many villages doing a lot of ministry and surviving anything the devil wanted to throw at us. And it was awesome. Let's go to the 80s.